My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about experimental philosophy with Kwame Anthony Appiah, author of Experiments in Ethics.
The great task of the humanities is to draw on the rich body of human creativity, both in literature and in the arts, music, film and so on, to help us interpret and live in our world. Cold, descriptive analysis of our world leaves out things that are important for human beings who are going to live in it. There has to be a perspective on the world that is the perspective of a human being facing the world as a world that is full of demands on her attention, demands on her time, things that excite her, things that attract her, things that repulse her. The sort of irreducibly human perspective is one that I think naturally sort of goes with the humanities, which are full of invitations to respond to the world in those ways. The fact that we're making progress in physics, I don't think that makes psychology obsolete, and the fact that we're making progress in psychology doesn't make economics obsolete. The fact that we're deepening our understanding of the physical and the biological and the social world in the scientific way makes obsolete other forms of understanding that we have in the humanities.
Listen to any Marketplace of Ideas interview anytime on our online archive on the website colinmarshallradio.com, or download them from iTunes. Open up iTunes and search for the Marketplace of Ideas. And there you can also subscribe and get it every single week automatically.
A lot of artists, I mean, it's like, it's something, it's music that you gotta touch and feel, you know what I'm saying?
My guest is Kwame Anthony Appiah, Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Philosophy at Princeton University, with a new book out called Experiments in Ethics, which seeks what philosophy has to gain from empirical data provided by experiments. Anthony, welcome to the program.
Hi, nice to be with you.
My first question is this. The idea of experimental philosophy, in large part, I think, due to your book, it's captured people's imaginations, especially on the internet. There's been a lot of buzz and what they call the blogosphere about it. But you say in the book that experimental philosophy is not a new thing. How old is experimental philosophy?
Like many things in the history of philosophy, it's rather hard to say when it began, because you could say it began when philosophy began, in the sense that someone like Aristotle, for example, wrote about natural history and dissected octopuses and things like that. And then again, if you start with something more modern, in the 17th and 18th centuries, people like Hume or Margaret Cavendish, these are people who thought that it was relevant to philosophy to think about psychology and even to develop psychological theories. What's happened, I think, in the 20th century was that long tradition of thinking about experimental evidence and looking at the world and in a sort of experimental way got pushed aside for a period, a relatively short period, perhaps 100 years, I mean, short by the history of philosophy standards, by people who were very preoccupied with separating philosophy from psychology, making sure that philosophy was about things that you could do without experiment, things that you could think about in as it were, your armchair, while the psychologists were becoming more and more experimental. So I think that the answer is that, in a way, the important question is, when did philosophy stop being experimental?
I see.
And the answer is that it stopped being experimental in the late 19th century when a couple of very influential figures really decided that it was important to separate philosophy from psychology.
That led to the way we think of philosophy today, which is guys able to do their discipline while not going beyond their own sense experience, correct?
Right, and just, basically, the president of the British Aristotelian Society said a few years ago in his presidential address, if anything can be done in an armchair, philosophy can. And I think that, that is the image, it's kind of Rodin's Le Penseur, the guy with his head on his fist, thinking. I'm not against thinking, and I love my armchair, but I think that you've got to have stuff to think about. When you're thinking particularly about ethics and about moral life, I think you have to take account not just of the world, which is obvious, because in order to decide what it's right to do, you have to know how the world is, of course. Nobody ever denied that. But I think you also have to think about how we are, about what human beings are like, about the mental tools that we have and the mental habits that we have that we bring to bear when we're faced with the decisions that we call moral or ethical decisions.
Now, not to put too fine a point on it, but are you saying that the tradition, the 100-year or so tradition of evidence-free philosophy has dead-ended?
Well, I don't know that it's... I mean, I think that there's always going to be a place for the people who want to think, very abstractly about things that have hardly any empirical content. But I do think that that's a mistake in moral philosophy. And again, one of the funny things about this is that about the time that people were really settling into the idea of moral philosophy as purely a priori, that is to say, to be done without looking at the external world, at the very time that was happening in English-speaking philosophy in the 1940s and 50s, there were already people saying, maybe we should actually develop a serious account of human psychology before we go on talking about moral philosophy. Maybe a lot of what we're saying is kind of not going to be very helpful until we have a deeper understanding of these questions in psychology. So in a funny way, even though if you asked people what they were doing, they would have said, well, we're doing conceptual analysis, we're trying to think about the concepts that you bring to bear in thinking about moral questions and in living your life. The fact is that all along there was this worry that how can you do that seriously without thinking about the mental tools that we have for doing it, and without thinking about what human beings are actually really like, what our capacities actually are. So in that sense, it's not quite fair to say that it ended, because in a certain sense, it never really took hold, the idea, the idea that it was just a sort of image of the philosopher as the purely a priori person that got established. But nobody was really ever seriously thinking that you could do important work in moral philosophy with complete disregard for how the world is and how people are.
Continuing the line of thought you just touched on, you've of course written a book about ethics, about moral philosophy. What makes the world of ethics a good candidate to be an experimental philosophy subject, to draw data from the scientific experiments?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is in part that when you're thinking about so in other words, we need to think about a contrast between some areas of philosophy and others. The other major areas of philosophy involve thinking about sort of the nature of things, how things are constituted, which we call metaphysics or ontology, and epistemology, which is thinking about knowledge, how we get to know about the world, how we justify our beliefs. We've taken a great deal of notice of how we get to justify our beliefs about the world in an empirical way all along. When you're thinking about, say, colors, about how we come to have beliefs about colors, or about what colors are, it's natural to take account of the fact that light bounces off objects, and that's how we detect colors, that it's connected with the wavelength, the frequency of light that is reflected or not reflected, absorbed by surfaces, and so on, right? I mean, people have sort of taken that into account. These are the results of scientific theories, the results of scientific analysis, but they've taken into account in thinking about epistemology. We have similar challenges in moral philosophy. That is, how does one come to a moral judgment? What is it in the person or in the world that explains why somebody comes to think that something is right or wrong? And that turns out to be a topic on which just recently we've been able to develop deeper understanding because in part of new techniques that the psychologists have. The psychologists now have ways of looking at brains when they're alive. Used to be the only way you could look at a brain was when a person was dead. But now with what's called functional magnetic resonance imaging, you can put someone in a machine and see which parts of their brain are active when they're doing various tasks or when they're thinking about various things. And so now we're beginning to be able to see, as it were, when someone is emotionally engaged with a question or when what they're doing is less emotional and more rational. And the old philosophical debates, which include debates about how the relative importance of reason and the emotions in our moral life, for example, can now be addressed in this very nice empirical way by looking to see which parts of the mind, which parts of the brain are active when people are thinking about moral problems. And that helps us, I think, with this old philosophical question about the relationship between reason and the emotions in moral life, which until recently we just didn't have the tools for looking at.
Data like these fMRI scans and all that, is this something that rocks moral philosophy to its very foundation, or is it just kind of a cool new thing to add on to everything else that moral philosophers have been using?
I think some people have the emotional parts of their brain stimulated by it, and other people have the rational parts of their brain stimulated by it. I mean, I think, it's a new tool, it's kind of exciting, so people are excited. I think once you start thinking about what these experiments show, you realize that large parts of what we have to do in interpreting the experiment involve pretty much conventional philosophical techniques of reflection and analysis. We should remember that all scientific activity is not just a matter of experiments. Nobody just does experiments. They have to think about what the experiments mean. They have to develop theories in order to develop the experiments that will test and allow them to explore the theories. And in a way, all that we're doing now in moral psychology is saying, look, there's a new kind of empirical input that's very useful, but the reflective part of it, the part that the philosophers have mostly been doing all along, still needs to be done, but it'll be impacted by these results, and it certainly has been. But you need to realize that the experimental results never interpret themselves. You have to interpret them in the light of theories, and you have to do critical reflection on them to try and make sense of them.
You would take this, say, fMRI data, and then you would head straight to the armchair with it, correct?
Something like that. I mean, you'd sort of bounce back and forth between the armchair and more data. You would hope that, if you're going to do an fMRI, you have to have access to a guy you have to have access to a medical person, because putting people into these machines, requires that you know what you're doing. So here at Princeton, for example, we in philosophy are on one side of something called Washington Street, and on the other side the psychologists, and they happen to have one of these machines. And so some of the most interesting recent work on this was begun by a young guy who got a PhD in philosophy here and had the thought of crossing the street to the psychologist and saying, look, we have these questions in philosophy, which I think that looking at brains will help with. And so a collaboration developed, and the collaboration, in fact, was so effective that this guy, Josh Green, is now in the psychology department at Harvard. He moved out of philosophy into the psychology department. But the tools that he used were a mixture of philosophical tools and psychological tools. So, for example, what he did was he took some traditional, when I say traditional, they're about 40 years old, philosophical conundrums, and he had people think about them while their brains were being watched. And that helped him to think about the question, when people are puzzling about moral problems, are they mostly responding with their emotions or with the rational parts of their brains? And it turned out that actually depended which moral problems they were thinking about.
And which moral problems were they? Which were these conundrums?
Okay, let me give you, so the simplest, the original experiment he did was with two very familiar to philosophers examples, which have to do, I'm afraid, with trolleys. That tells you how old the examples are, because in most places don't have trolleys anymore. So there are two quick experiments, two quick thought experiments, that is, things you ask people to think about. A trolley running down a track, coming to a junction where it can go left or right. On the right, if you leave it, it will go straight ahead and kill 5 people. If you turn the switch, it will go onto the left-hand track and it'll kill 1 person who's on the track. You can't warn anybody, there's nothing you can do, these are the only options. If you ask people that question in this country, about, I think, between 80 and 90% of them are likely to say that you should switch the tracks. That it's better for 1 person to die than for 5 people to die, and that they're willing to intervene to bring that about. So that's scenario 1. Second scenario, same sort of situation, except that the way you're going to stop the trolley from killing the 5 people is not by diverting it onto a track, but by pushing a large man in front of it. And he's big enough to stop it. So from a certain abstract point of view, it's the same situation. You've got 5 people or 1 person, and if you kill the 1, the 5 won't die. Turns out that most people won't do that. They won't push a fat man in front of a trolley. one of the things that Josh Green was able to do was to give these puzzles to people and ask them, what do you think is right? What do you think the right thing to do is? And what he noticed was the following pattern. In the first case, people just thought of it as, people responded pretty coolly. They didn't get emotionally very engaged. And they just saw it as a problem of picking between one person dying and 5 person dying, and other things being equal. It's better if one person dies, so they did it. So they thought it was the right thing to do. But in the second case, because this is his analysis, because they actually had to imagine somebody pushing somebody off a bridge, that's much more emotional. And so in that case, the emotional parts of their brains kicked in, and his analysis is that that's why people won't do it in the second case and will do it in the first. It's because in the second case, they have this sense that they're personally involved in causing the harm, whereas in the first case, they're just diverting a trolley onto a track. Now, I don't think you have to accept that explanation of the difference between the two cases to see that the fact that the brains of people thinking about the second problem look different from the brains of the people thinking about the first problem is the beginnings of a helpful piece of evidence in thinking about what's going on.
So some conundrums are received emotionally, some are received rationally, and it has to do with the proximity you put the person to the issue itself?
Right. His proposal is that we and he's done further experiments with other problems which seem to suggest that one of the issues is just how, as he says, up close and personal the harm is that you're considering. And if you're considering a harm that's up close and personal, you're less likely to agree to do it, he thinks, even if it'll save, some lives. Whereas if it's sort of distant and remote, and you're just considering the remote, distant death of one person as opposed to the remote, distant death of 5 people, you'll pick the smaller number of deaths. Now, I myself think that that can't be the whole story, and that's because if you think, if you conclude that in that case, in the case of the fat man, the people are responding with their emotions, and that therefore what they should do is calm down and respond with their reason, and that therefore what they should do is push the person off the bridge, then you're supposing that it's always okay to cause the death of one person in order to extend significantly the lives of 5 other people. If that were true, then any time you went near a hospital, if you were a healthy person, anybody would be entitled to grab you and take your liver and kidneys and lungs and so on, and save and extend the lives of 5 people who needed them. And they could say in their defense, well, look, it's true we killed one person, but we extend the lives of 5 people. And that seems wrong. So, and that's a reason for saying that while these experiments are helpful, they help us think about these questions, they don't decide what the right answer is, because, as I said, further reflection might lead you to think maybe what the emotions are leading people to do in the case where they're not pushing the person on the bridge, maybe that's the right thing to do, and maybe it turns out that in moral life emotions are actually important, that you shouldn't ignore your emotions. So those are 2 possibilities. One is that we should ratchet down the emotions and simply do a calculation when we're making moral decisions. The other possibility is that our emotions are actually things that evolved enough to help us make the moral decisions, and that attending to our emotions will often lead us to do the right thing. Deciding between those 2 views isn't something that an experiment is going to help you with. You've got to think about that on your own.
When moral philosophy comes to making normative judgments, there's nothing you can get from an experiment.
Well, the experiment isn't going to answer the normative question for you. You can find it helpful in thinking your way through, but in the end, you're going to have to make the normative decision on the basis of other kinds of considerations, I think.
You mentioned that these are people in America responding to these questions. What happens when you take it to other places?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. One thing that I know is that it turns out that people in China are less likely to feel that they should intervene at all in these trolley cases. So they're less likely to say yes, even in the first case. So there are cultural differences. They're less likely to. Of course, some of them will, just as here, some people won't. I mean, you never get 100% in these things. But there's a lesser tendency to intervene at all, apparently, in the Chinese case. And also the Chinese have been presented with these problems like the problem of the organ donors. So if you say to most Americans, you're in a small town in the West and you're the sheriff and there's a crowd around the jail and you know that the person in there didn't do the crime, but you also know that if you don't let the crowd hang your prisoner, they'll burn down the prison and parts of the town. People here tend to be reluctant to think that it's okay in those circumstances, if the person is innocent, to hand them over. It turns out that if you ask that question in China, people are more likely to say, okay, well, it's the best thing to do, or after all, the best thing to do, all things considered, is to minimize the amount of death and suffering, and if the best way to do that is to kill an innocent person, go ahead. So there are these cultural differences, and again, I think they're very interesting and important. They're relevant to questions about to the extent to which moral judgments should be regarded as relative to your cultural background and that sort of thing. They're relevant to that, but they don't really answer the question, who's right? The fact that Chinese people are less likely to intervene or more likely to accept the death of an innocent person if it's necessary to save lives and property, the fact that they're likely to do that doesn't mean, doesn't make it true that it's correct, any more than the fact that most people here think the opposite means that they're correct. As I say, these sorts of results are very helpful in trying to sharpen your sense of how culture, for example, comes to bear in shaping people's moral responses. It doesn't tell you how it should come to bear, but it tells you how it does come to bear, and that can be part of what you have to think about.
And this is touching on one of the most fascinating things in the book, in my opinion, which is how the setting, how the context, how the factors you would think not directly related to a situation affects how someone makes a moral choice in that situation. And what are some examples of that are your favorites?
Here's a very simple one. It's part of traditional moral thinking to suppose that being helpful and considerate to strangers is a good thing. And you have opportunities to do that quite often because you're often faced with a situation where someone comes up to you with a buck and asks for 4 quarters because they want to park their car and they need to put some money in the parking meter. Question: how likely is it that people will respond in that way? Well, there are many variables that are relevant, but here's one. They're much more likely to do it if they're standing outside a bakery which is producing the smell of freshly baked bread. When I say much more likely, 5 times more likely, incredibly much more likely. Now, the people who give change outside a bakery don't know that the fact that they're in a place that smells good is affecting them, and they're certainly not giving you the change because the bread smells good. I mean, they're not saying to themselves, oh, this bread smells good, let me give them some money. So they're being affected by something which seems morally irrelevant. It doesn't seem relevant to whether you should be helpful, whether you're smelling the odors of nicely, freshly baked bread. It doesn't seem relevant at all to whether you should give people change, but it turns out to be the sort of thing that affects people a lot. And in general, lots of things that you can do that just lift people's mood by making them feel, that they're having a good experience or that they've been lucky, will make them behave not just slightly better, but fantastically much better in these sorts of small ways. That's relevant to many debates in the history of moral philosophy, but it's particularly relevant to a debate about the importance of character. Aristotle, who in a way begins ethics in the Western tradition, Socrates thought about it too, but Aristotle was the first person to write a book with the word ethics in the title, thought that the development of character was enormously important. But if what people do depends more on their circumstances than on their characters, then maybe what we should be focusing on isn't changing people's characters, but changing people's circumstances. If people are more likely to be generous and thoughtful when they're in a good mood, maybe we should be thinking about how to keep people in a good mood, rather than how to teach people to be generous and thoughtful. Again, maybe. The armchair is where you have to go to think about these things. But the evidence that we are very, very sensitive to our situations. I mean, there's a position in social psychology which is called situationism just because of this, because they just keep discovering that people are creatures of their circumstances to a remarkable degree, and the features of the circumstances that make a difference are very surprising. I mean, small changes in, for example, the level of ambient noise. If you have a very loud level of ambient noise, people are less likely to be helpful. As I said, certain pleasant smells are going to make people helpful. Finding a dime waiting for you in the slot when you're using a coin box, a telephone, that turns out to lift people's mood. And if you ask someone who's just had that experience to help you, they're something like 10 times as likely to do so as someone who hasn't found a dime. Now, it can't be because a dime makes a big difference in anybody's life. It has to be because they feel that they've had a good thing happen to them, even though it's not a good thing of any great significance. And nevertheless, it has this huge effect on behavior. One of the joys of going to social psychology lectures is that they can produce hundreds of examples of this sort of thing.
Taking the situationist point of view and thinking about how might the world be changed in order to create situations where people are going to act morally, it's hard, I can't think of what those actions would be. I mean, assuming that I had a full omnipotence over the world, I don't know, would I go around putting dimes into phone booths? So I'm not sure what the solution is taking the situation point of view.
One thing it suggests from the individual point of view is that it's reasonable to worry yourself when you're feeling unhelpful or helpful about what it is that is responsible for your your attitude. And to the extent that you know that you're going to be unhelpful when you're a dry goods store where there's no good smells, you have the opportunity at least to, as it were, raise your consciousness and say, look, I'm going to be particularly unlikely to be helpful in this place. If I want to be helpful in general, then it's going to be harder for me here, and so I must put more effort into it. So there's a sort of way in which you can feed it into your own thinking about yourself. But the more obvious and simple thing is, I conclude from this that since it's generally speaking a good idea for people to be helpful, nothing wrong with a supermarket spraying pleasant smells into the air.
It seems harmless to me.
There are, of course, interesting and important ethical questions about changing people's behavior by manipulating their circumstances. We in general, we worry about manipulating people. But in this sort of case, where what you're getting them to do is something that they are not likely to think it's bad to do, it's not likely you're getting them into doing something that they shouldn't be doing, according to them or according to you, it seems harmless. When you start, here's another example which has actually been discussed by people contemplating issues in law schools, thinking about these things. I think Cass Sunstein has a proposal like this in his most recent book. It turns out that if you ask people to opt out of a pension plan, very few of them do. It turns out that if you ask people to opt into a pension plan, very few of them do.
They just don't want to opt.
People are just, they think they'll think about it later. They know they have the option and so on. And if you think that it's, in general speaking, better for people to have pension plans than not, then maybe the default should be opting out. That will produce a few people who really don't want a pension plan, who take the trouble to opt out. But mostly it will produce people who have pension plans. And that's a good thing in a society like ours, which doesn't have very good public provisions for support for people. There's a case where people have two options, and you have to set one of them as the default. If you set one as a default, lots of people will do what we think is the right thing. And if you set the other as the default, lots of people will do what we think is the wrong thing for them. So why not set the default in a way that they'll do the right thing?
I'm going to ask kind of a grand, silly question about this, but people recognizing their own biases of organic origin, if everybody realized what they were being made to do by their own, say, neurochemistry, would that be a potential solution to the human-created problems of the world?
To figure that out, the best evidence we have is to look at the people who know this stuff and see whether they behave better than the rest of us.
Oh, yes. There's an experiment.
And I think the answer is that Dan Gilbert, who's a psychologist at Harvard University, has suggested that a lot of the stuff we know is stuff that it's very difficult to put to use. I think in one of his books he says something like, look, I'm going to tell you a lot of things that you could use to make your life better, but one of the things my evidence suggests is that you won't. Here, disregard this as free information. Don't think of the stuff you're actually going to be able to use, because it turns out that people find it very hard to use this stuff. I think I mentioned before when you asked what we can do with it, that we can try and sort of use it for consciousness raising, but I've tried that myself, obviously. And just to give you an example, I mean, there's a lot of literature in political psychology that suggests that the things we respond to in political speeches have nothing at all to do with whether they really agree with deep principles of our own. They have to do with pretty superficial features.
A very relevant subject for this year in America.
A very relevant subject for this year. So the world is full of people who are, say, just to say some random things, excited by Obama, irritated by Clinton, and reassured by McCain when they listen to them. I think that those sorts of feelings are almost entirely to be discounted when you're trying to figure out whether someone is offering the right policies, and when you're trying to figure out whether, if they are offering the right policies, they have any chance of being able to carry them out, to bring them to completion, to fruition. And so I've actually resolved relatively to take my speeches in writing. I read speeches in the Times or on the web or somewhere when people make speeches. If somebody tells me that somebody has an important speech, I do the opposite of what everybody else is doing these days, which is I do not go to YouTube. I avoid YouTube. I avoid
good move.
The television accounts. I try to take the words in and think about them, think about what's being said. I try. But the fact is I can't avoid occasionally on the web seeing a bit of tape of one of these people, and I find myself responding to it. I'm excited by Obama and irritated by Clinton and reassured by McCain, and this all seems to me irrelevant. But I can't help feeling it. I can't. It's rather like something that we've known a lot the psychology of for a very long time. We've known for a very long time about certain illusions, visual illusions. If I draw, a cube of lines on the board, it'll look to you three-dimensional. You know it isn't three-dimensional, but it still looks three-dimensional. It's sort of like that. You know that your mind is tricking you into treating a flat object as if it was three-dimensional, but you can't stop seeing it that way. And I think the same thing happens with a lot of these political responses. Even though I have a theory about why I'm responding in these ways, and even though I think because of why I'm responding in these ways that I shouldn't take these responses very seriously, I nevertheless find myself moved by them, and I sort of, there I am in the voting booth, and I think, well, should I, what should I do? Should I go with my sort of gut, or should I write down 15 important things in American politics and check off and see who gets 12 of them and who gets 9 and who gets 6? What should I do? And I find it very hard to say, in part because of a question that connects with what we talked about at the very beginning, which is, in human life, unlike in the lives of the sort of rational Spock-like creatures that some people imagine, sometimes leading with your emotions actually has a pretty good chance of getting you to what you would think was the right answer. And sometimes calculating and putting it down on paper and removing all the emotional content from a situation actually takes out of the situation the very things that really matter for human purposes. And deciding which of those is right in this case, I think, is very hard. I don't think it's at all obvious what the right answer is. And that's just one instance of, I think, the difficulty of figuring out how to bring this knowledge to bear in your own life. It's much easier to bring it to bear in the sort of way that I suggested, where supermarkets can put the smell of fresh bread in the air, and legislation can make having a pension a default, because those are things that people can discuss and reflect upon and then decide to do and shape the world in such a way that they will shape human responses. But shaping your own responses is much harder, I think.
The discipline of experimental philosophy, as we're going to call it, such as it is so far, how much is it using or accepting or drawing upon experimental data from other disciplines that already exist, and how much of it is conducting deliberate experimental philosophy experiments?
Good. I think that's a very important distinction, and perhaps one that I didn't make enough of in the book. Both of those things, as you imply, are going on, and for example, all the situationist social psychology wasn't done in order to help philosophers. It was done because it was interesting to psychologists. So that's just a case where philosophers thinking about moral questions have read the social psychology literature and used it to draw conclusions. But in the case that I mentioned of the work on thinking about trolley problems, for example, that really was initiated by a philosopher going to a psychologist and saying, here's an experiment that we could do together that's relevant to things that philosophers are interested in, and by the way, it ought to be relevant to things that psychologists are interested in too. There's another line of experimental work which I haven't mentioned so far, which is much simpler. It doesn't involve fMRI machines. It just involves essentially questionnaire research where you ask people what they think about various scenarios, and you do statistics. There's a lot of that going on right now. It's actually being done by people in philosophy departments. Those are experiments that are actually being done by philosophers addressed to questions that philosophers are interested in. And the main, very simple underlying thought is philosophers have long been interested in conceptual analysis, in how people think about things. In order to figure out how people think about things, you can either think about it yourself and come to a conclusion, or you can get other people to think about it and see what conclusion they come to. And in the past, philosophers have mostly done the experiments on themselves. They've just asked themselves what they thought about these scenarios. It turns out that if you ask other people, if you ask especially non-philosophically trained people, you get a very interesting, often a very interesting pattern of response, which is somewhat surprising. Just to mention an example of this, another young philosopher by the name of Joshua Knobe, who's at the University of North Carolina, for his dissertation, he did some experiments of this sort. And here's one. He asked people to consider a CEO of a company who's being offered a chance of a policy that will raise the company's profits, and by the way, it'll damage the environment. The CEO says, well, I only care about profits. I want to raise the profits of the company, so let's go ahead. It's true that it'll damage the environment, but I don't care about that. That's irrelevant. You ask people, did the CEO intentionally damage the environment? Again, about 80% of people, I think, say yes, he intentionally damaged the environment. But if you switch it around and you say the same story, except that the advisor says, by the way, it'll advance the environment, it'll be good for the environment, and the CEO says, I don't care about the environment, I just care about profits, so even though it's good for the environment, I don't care about that, what I care about is good for profits. And if you ask people, different people, whether they think that this person has intentionally advantaged the environment, they're inclined to say no. Again, 20-30% of them will say yes. Most of them won't say that. So here we get an asymmetry that if the result is good, the person is not said to have done it intentionally, but if they've done it, if it's bad, they're said to have done it intentionally. At least that's one way of interpreting these experiments. Now, it hadn't occurred to most philosophers before these experiments were done, I don't think, that in deciding whether somebody has intended to do something, we think about whether the thing that they foresaw as a consequence of what they're doing was a good thing or a bad thing. It hadn't occurred to most people that was a possible view. This set of experiments suggests very much that is what's going on. And so, again, you go back to your armchair and you ask yourself, is there a way of thinking about intention that makes sense, in which whether somebody intended something depends on whether it was a good or a bad thing, a good or a bad result? As you would expect, philosophers all have very different answers to that question once they're in the armchair. But again, this is an experiment done by a philosopher, motivated by a philosophical problem, the problem of intention, which has been helpful, I think, in shaping our thinking about that philosophical question. And this was done with no psychologists at all. It was just done by philosophers using a questionnaire.
One of the things that experimental philosophy seems to reveal, and it seems to me like a little bit of a danger to some of the great old philosophical writings, is that when a philosopher says that it is natural to do X thing in response to X situation, or this is what would happen, or this is how you would reply to this statement when said to you, it's really that's what that philosopher himself would say.
Yes. Well, I think that one of the most important and sort of discussed features of these sorts of experiments is the fact that it's, 80% of people who give an answer, or 83%, or 85%. There are very few of these cases where everybody gives the same answer. In a way, that's not surprising. After all, if the answer were completely obvious, there wouldn't be a philosophical dispute about what the right answer is. Usually, among the answers, if you sort of sample enough opinions, usually among the opinions you sample, you'll come up with many of the views that philosophers have held over the centuries or millennia about the question. One will turn out to be the commonest one, but there'll be, 15, 20% of people who hold some other view, often a view that itself has philosophical defenders. So I think that it's good to sort of make explicit the fact that, as you said, often when a philosopher says it would be natural to say, what he means is, I find it natural to say. and if he can't, I'm interested, because what Kant found it natural to say is something that has weight for me, since I respect him. But he's still only one very thoughtful person, and if in the end I decide that it wouldn't be natural to say that, or that even though it is natural to say it, it's actually the wrong thing to say, which is another possibility, then I'm going to free myself from the particular views of a particular philosopher. Yes, I think it is a reminder that when people say that something is intuitive or natural or the obvious thing to say, often that only means that it's intuitive or natural or obvious for them and people like them, and there'll be other people around who aren't like them. And in the end, the correct philosophical answer is going to have to be one that settles whether the majority or the minority is right, or whether some other view that neither of them has come up with is the correct one.
Now, I mentioned earlier in the show that experimental philosophy has gotten a whole lot of buzz on the blogs, and your book as well has gotten a lot of press. And of course, you had the article in Idea Lab in the New York Times that preceded it, and there's this YouTube video called, I believe, the Experimental Philosophy Anthem, featuring a burning armchair. And there's been a whole lot of that. Now, what do you think about experimental philosophy is just so capturing the imagination of people?
In one way, I am an instance of the thing we were just talking about. I find it fascinating, and so I suppose I don't find it surprising that other people find it fascinating. But if somebody doesn't find it fascinating, I confess I have nothing to say to them about why they should exactly. And I think it is, a lot of people did some philosophy in college and found it very abstract and sort of logic-y and difficult to follow. And the idea that, you could actually have some of these relatively clearly described experiments be relevant to it makes it interesting to people. I think people are very interested at the moment in what we're learning about the brain in things like functional magnetic resonance imaging. And so that, I think, is part of what attracts people to it, is the fact that this is part of the wider fascination in our society at the moment with what we're learning as we begin to be able to study the live brain and brains which are doing things rather than just cutting them out when the owners are dead. So I think that's part of it. I think also that people are always interested in approaches to the big questions of life. How should I live? What is it for life to go well? What is it for a human life to be a good life? The idea that one can bring experiment to bear on that question in a society in which we think that many things are to be understood in part by experimental investigation. I think that's an idea that's people are likely to find attractive. So I think there are lots of sort of small reasons, but I have to confess the sort of tsunami of interest surprised me, I am a bit unclear about it, and I'm, since this is going out on the air, I urge everybody out there to do the experiments necessary to try and figure out why people have gotten so excited about experiments in ethics.
Now, the convergence between, or the interaction between, or the sharing of knowledge between humanities and the natural sciences has been a really big subject on this show. I've had a bunch of people on who work in those areas or observe those areas. And there's a fear that goes around, especially in the humanities quarters, that science is in a way encroaching, or science is a cancer upon what they're doing, or science is subsuming their fields, and that soon, or maybe not soon, but in some time, the humanities will be subsumed by some form of quantitative causal science. Now, you don't seem to fear that.
No, I don't, because I'm a great as you can gather, I'm a fan of experimental science and experimental method, but I think it has its place, and the great task of the humanities, not just philosophy, the great task of the humanities is to draw on the rich body of human creativity, both in literature and in the arts, and in music and film and so on, to help us interpret and live in our world. And a kind of cold, descriptive analysis of our world leaves out things that are important for human beings who are going to live in it. There has to be a perspective on the world that is the perspective of a human being facing the world as a world that is full of demands on her attention, demands on her time, things that excite her, things that attract her, things that repulse her. And that perspective on the world, that the sort of irreducibly human perspective, is one that I think naturally sort of goes with the humanities, which are full of invitations to respond to the world in those ways. So I don't see any more than I think that the fact that we're making progress in physics, I don't think that makes psychology obsolete, and the fact that we're making progress in psychology doesn't make economics obsolete. And I don't think that the fact that we're deepening our understanding of the physical and the biological and the social worlds in the scientific way makes obsolete other forms of understanding that we have in the humanities. So I'm in favor of my view is this: we humans live with many pictures of the world. We do not live with one picture. Nobody has a totally integrated picture of the world. I don't know how to integrate together my picture of the world as a physical place with my picture of the world as a psychological place. I have a psychological picture of the world. I have a physical picture of the world. And I use them both as appropriate. And I have I have many poetic pictures of the world. I have literary pictures of the world. I have musical pictures of the world. I have many ways of representing reality and the sort of needs and challenges of the world. And I move among them. I need them all to make human sense of the world. I don't fear these interactions. I think they're very useful. They do have an effect on what we do in the humanities, just as the scientists who inhabit our world live in the world as people who go to the movies and read novels. Occasionally, perhaps even read philosophy or criticism. So I'm not worried about these things. I share with some people the worry that in seeing the advance of certain kinds of quantitative methods in the sciences, people assume that it's going to be the case that we'll make progress in the humanities by quantifying things. And there are things that are not worth quantifying, and there are also things which one can use non-quantificational, non-numerical, but nevertheless formal techniques for thinking about. So I think sometimes people who are worried about the encroachment of the sciences are people who have a limited sense, actually, of the full range of things, forms of analysis that the sciences can engage in, and they think that all of it is just going to be about numbers. Large parts of science are not about numbers. They're about other kinds of analysis. So I think we can live with many pictures, many kinds of analysis, and while some forms of analysis, once some pictures do become obsolete, I mean, we no longer have the picture of the world in which, most of us don't have a picture of the world in which it's occupied by ghosts, for example. We've given up that picture of the world, except for the purposes of literature. So I'm not saying that pictures of the world, parts of the picture of the world never become obsolete. They do, but I don't think that it's a serious possibility that you could continue to sort of live as a human being without the forms of picture of the world that you get from the humanities.
The book, one more time, is Experiments in Ethics. Anthony Appiah, thanks so much for coming on the program.
It was a great pleasure. Very good to talk to you.
For more information on Kwame Anthony Appiah, visit Appiah, APPIAH.net. Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, benalthouse, that's BENALTHOUSE.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.